Okay, it looks like we're having some issues with the sound, and I'm really hoping that by recording it this way, the sound works okay. So we'll find out. But everybody who's joined on the call tonight can't hear me, and we'll just do the best we can. Okay, this week we are talking about Romanticism and Realism. Last week we talked about the Enlightenment era, and that ended right at the close of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. So we're talking about 1810 or so. One of the problems is when we're dealing with different periods of art, there aren't any real clear dates. And it gets kind of frustrating because it would be wonderful if we could say that the Enlightenment kept going until May 17th at 2:30 in the afternoon in June of 18 or May 17th, 2:30 in the afternoon of 1810, but we can't. It kind of fades into each other, these different movements. And now as we come closer to today, we're going to shift from art periods into art movements, and that's what we call the Romantic and Realist eras. In just a second, we'll talk a little bit about what the difference is between art periods and movements. But at first, I wanted to show some examples of Romanticism and Realism to let you see what we're looking forward into shifting into. I provide some background of this part or this time period. The Enlightenment really opened the door to the beginning of critical thinking about um, self-awareness, examining a personal situation. Uh, until the Enlightenment, there wasn't an awful lot of examples that survive of people talking intently about self-reflection outside of religious texts. Hildegard von Bingen and St. Augustine are really good examples of people that did do a lot of self-reflection in a spiritual context. In the Enlightenment era, we started seeing, because people did have access to printing presses, because people did have access to income that allowed them to write extensively and still make a living, uh, because people were interested in reading that kind of thing. We do see with the growth of newspapers, the growth of book publishing, a lot of self-reflection happening more and more. We see the coupling of people sharing thoughts about scientific rationale, scientific method, applying science to different things. And this combination of things really helped pave the way for the Industrial Revolution, which happens at this time as well. In the 18th century, the Industrial Revolution really starts taking off. We also see a lot of political revolution, where people are redesigning their governments, uh, either trying to clean up what they live in or trying to transform the government and build a new one. The shift starts becoming apparent at the opening of the 19th century. We're talking about 1810, 1830, in that era. We do see a shift from subject matter and an expansion of perspective as it well, I don't know if perspective is the right word, because I'm not looking for a word that talks about points converging, like when you learn how to draw in perspective. I'm talking more about what is the artist trying to portray from their own site? What are they trying to portray that they think would be interesting to potential viewers? That kind of perspective. So we see a shift from, we were looking at religious imagery in the Renaissance and Baroque, and that kind of shifted into more science and history imagery in the Enlightenment era. And now, as we move into realism and romanticism, we're going to see a shift even more away from that religious stuff that was going on with Renaissance and Baroque. This image of Salisbury Cathedral, okay, Salisbury Cathedral, you think it'd be religious, but this is done in 1831, and it is a landscape. This is where things like landscapes really start taking off. Now, I should mention that we have a specific shift in viewership. Who's going to own the paintings? Who's going to be looking at them? A lot of the times, up until now, people who are painters, their paintings were paid for by very wealthy families, royal families, noble families, church families, church organizations, uh, groups of people that made a lot of money as merchants, for example. One of the miracles as a result of the Industrial Revolution is that, yes, you still have an awful lot of very, very desperately poor people. But as factories start growing up, as cottage industries start expanding, as people start expanding in the capacity to take part in the economic landscape, you start seeing an exponential growth of the middle income families. So this is for the people that are between the very wealthy and the people that are desperately poor. These are people that they can't afford a palace, they can't afford a castle, but they can afford a home for themselves. Maybe they can't afford all, the huge landscaping, the great estates and all that kind of stuff, but they can afford perhaps a carriage for themselves. They can really start to buy things that make their home more beautiful for them, as well as maybe buying other things that are intended specifically to show their neighbors they have the wealth to sink into something that doesn't do anything other than just sit there. So you get families that can actually afford to pay for paintings who are not wealthy. So paintings are going to be a more digestible size, for example. But to cater with this expansion of potential viewership, I think that that goes a long way in explaining why subject matter of paintings change. So for Romanticism, we're going to be looking at what people in the middle income brackets, for example, what are they interested in seeing? What are the kinds of things that are exciting to them? So these aren't the extraordinarily wealthy families, probably well-to-do, for example, that would like people to believe that they're salt of the earth. And then later on, as we go into realism, this was also subject matters that seem to be more acceptable, more appropriate, more interesting to the people that have that middle income. Remember, the political tides have shifted quite a bit as well. More and more ordinary people are having an actual voice in government. And I think that there may be a connection to wealthy people uh, shifting their tastes because they realize that maybe part of the reason why they can, or maybe part of the way that they can stay where they are politically and economically is by paying attention to what ordinary people are saying that they need as they gain power in the political sphere. But I don't understand how all those things fit together, but there is a definite shift in who holds the reins of economic power, who has control of economy, and what are the interests that need to be met by artists. On the other side, with the Industrial Revolution, we also see a dramatic decrease in the cost of materials for art supplies. Painting is a lot less expensive, and canvas is going to be less expensive. I think it was Renoir who said that in the Industrial Revolution, they were able to invent tubes of flexible metal that paint could be stored in. So you didn't have to mix your own paint. And Renoir said that the tubes for paint is what made later art movements possible. So it's less, so you get more and different kinds of paintings as well from the painter side, in addition to more and different kinds of paintings being seen, because tastes that from people that can afford paintings are changing as well. And the two different styles we're going to be talking about specifically are Romanticism and Realism. And I really recommend you watch these videos that talk about what Romanticism is. And then here's a couple ones that talk about some very specific images and talk about them at length. And then this is Realism. I want to give a little bit more background on Romanticism. As middle income increases, people with middle incomes increase. This is where the idea of living in the country, escaping the city, escaping the slums of the city, those kinds of things become more attractive. People with money don't have to live next to a factory to work. People, they can live and have a functioning home that out by the farmlands that doesn't have to live on a farm. They don't have to be farmers in order to live out in the country. And so there is this kind of attractive nature or attractiveness associated with returning to quote unquote nature, living out in the countryside, extolling the virtues of the bucolic lifestyle. The farmers have it made. They don't have to worry about the stink and sewage of the city. Of course, the problem with that is the farmers are, if you live in desperate circumstances on a farm, it's going to be just as miserable as if you live in desperate circumstances in the city. The biggest difference is going to be the smells are not the same. But that doesn't make any difference to the people who can afford the paintings. They're not dealing with the realities of life. They're dealing with the realities of the perception of life. And so Romanticism has to do with subject matter that glorifies the virtues of a country life. So you're going to have people peacefully, you can imagine if you were really this farmer who was trying to get his wagon across this flooded river after a rainstorm, or flooded creek bed after a rainstorm, he's probably swearing up a storm. But the way that it's portrayed is this is a beautiful, peaceful setting. Nature has stretched herself a little bit, and he's peacefully dealing with the consequences. We have nature in extravagant glory here with beautifully detailed tree, looks very naturalistic. Notice that the humans they're there because the shapes are appropriate and they're wearing clothing. And then we get these incredible clouds, absolutely beautiful clouds. So the subject matter is going to be a person near a stream, and an ordinary everyday person near a stream, but the focus is on just the glories of nature, how beautiful this is. Now, of course, it's not, we're not talking about unmarked nature. It's obvious that there's houses and stuff. This is Salisbury Cathedral, but the focus is on how gorgeous these trees are, how beautiful this is, how expansive the sky is, and that the people in the wagon and the livestock are almost afterthoughts. Now, at about the same time, instead of wanting to go back to nature, people are also thinking, well, what else can we talk about? We've already talked about religion. We've already talked about history. What else is there to talk about? Well, painters started looking at things that happened every day that they saw all the time, all around them. So these are a couple women with a donkey and a dog and their wares. They're going to market, presumably, but they're waiting for the ferry to come back and pick them up and take them across the river. There's absolutely nothing historically important about this scene. There's very little that ties us to religious stories from the Bible. They are not members of a royal family. This is just a real everyday scene that happens all the time, everywhere around the world. And that's where realism gets its name. Romanticism, if people are romanticizing that connection of human beings and nature, where nature almost becomes its own uh, member of the storyline, its own character. Realism gets its name from the type of scenes that are depicted. These are also called genre scenes. Just normal, everyday, run of the mill type of stuff that a normal, everyday, run of the mill type of person would experience. And I think you can kind of see that they're still dealing with the idea of naturalistic portrayal that people have been really excited about since the Renaissance. But here, the figures aren't nearly as detailed as anything that we've seen during even the Baroque or Enlightenment era. But it does feel like this is a normal, everyday scene that anybody would see because there's nothing spectacular going on. And I want you to watch Understanding the Styles of Art Realism as well. So we're going to look at a couple examples a little bit closer. This is Abbey Among the Oak Trees. I'll get to it. I'm setting up the image. There we go. In this video, it's only about 4 minutes, but they're talking about why this painting is important. So I would really like you to watch this video as well. Abbey Among the Oak Trees. This is an example of Romanticism. Now this looks kind of devastated. I mean, it's a barren landscape. The trees are dead. And the human figures, I'm sorry about this. I don't know how to get rid of that. See if I can. I wonder if that, I don't know if that got rid of it. Sorry. Okay, I'm not able to get rid of the, well, let's see if that'll do it. Okay, there we go. Okay. So going back to this painting and looking at it, there are some human figures right down here. This is a devastated landscape. It looks like it's winter right before the heavy snow falls. All the trees are dead. Why this fits into Romanticism is that this is evidence of the processes of nature taking over. The Abbey, the only thing standing of the Abbey is this one wall. Humans are almost an afterthought, and if you didn't know they were there, you'd think they were gravestones or tree trunks, just like the other things. Trees are dead, yes, but that is also part of the natural process of nature. This is an almost ethereal view of that kind of liminal space that exists in midwinter in nature, where there isn't a holiday, people aren't active in the landscape, but the natural processes are taking over. So it's a very romantic kind of view of the natural processes of decay. Now, the other one that I brought out is this kind of shows doesn't fit into that exactly right, but this is still fits into the romantic area. It doesn't not I'm sorry, this is still a romantic era painting, but it does not fit into that narrative of romanticism being nature is taking over everything. This is a little bit different. This is by the same guy who was really big during the Enlightenment era. His name was Delacroix. He did the Oath of the Horatii, which they that was something that was used to inspire the people in the French Revolution. This is called Women of Algiers. And this is fits into the Romantic era because, again, he's romanticizing something that is not an something that a city person would see all the time. This is not a natural setting. This is inside of a building that's supposed to take place in Algiers. He painted in France. Algiers is in Africa, so people are most likely never going to see this. These women are in a brothel, and I imagine that the actual setting is probably not going to be very much like this. I don't know, but Delacroix is painting what he kind of hopes it would be like. So it's the same kind of perspective of the earlier where the artists are taking or showing that nature is over everything. You know, kind of extolling the virtues of nature. It's not it's not portraying a very realistic or practical view of the world, but this is what romanticism is all about. You know, if I had my druthers, what would I want to see? And even the depressing one with the abbey in the middle of the bleak, dying tree forest, you're still maybe that's not what it actually looks like, but that's what the artist was hoping to see. And this is where the idea of romanticism comes in, where it's a kind of a fantasy perspective of what the world might be like. So I wonder why I'm trying really hard to. There we go. Okay. Now I want to show a couple examples of realism in contrast to that. I think that these are, you know, I give general guidelines about what realism or romanticism is, and then I show you immediately something that is very different to that. So this is an image of the Gleaners from the realism uh, movement. These are three women that are gleaning grain. Gleaning is after the threshers are all done, collecting the vast majority of the grain. Gleaners, typically very desperately poor people, follow after, trying to find whatever kernels of grain they can that have been left on the ground. And the landscape is huge behind them. The sky seems I don't know, it just seems kind of blank. The focus is on these three women doing what they do. And it seems to be an immortalization of an activity done by the desperately poor. So there's no religious overtones. There's no extolling the virtues of nature. There's no romanticizing anything, really, because you know there's nothing really romantic and attractive about being desperately poor. But this is a good example. It's called realism because this is a real thing that happened. You know, these are real human beings. Now, you know, talk about that, but then I want to show you something that kind of goes against that as well. You know, those generalizations. And this is called the burial at Ornans. Now, this is a religious theme. We can see it's a religious theme. It's a burial. We have religious figures here. Somebody's even carrying a cross. But instead of being Enlightenment stuff where it focuses on science, or instead of being, or historical events, instead of being Baroque or Renaissance where it focuses on religious imagery, religion is a part of the scene. But look at where people are looking. All these people are talking to each other. They're ignoring this guy. This kid is just kind of staring off in space. There's a dog here, for crying out loud. This person seems to be one of the very few people that are actually looking at whoever has been buried. Everybody else is talking. Everybody else. I mean, this feels overall like what an actual funeral is going to be like. Not everybody is going to be sitting on one knee paying attention to the crowning of Napoleon. They're all looking at different things. They're all paying attention to different things. It feels like a very believable landscape, and it feels like a very believable situation with ordinary, believable people. And that's what makes it realist. I hope this is kind of making sense to people what those two differences are. And I want to share this really quick. As we've moved forward from the Renaissance, looking at very different groups of people, and generally what we've been looking at is cultures and what the cultures produced art-wise. That, and I want to make you aware of something called an art movement as opposed to an art period. Even though these are synonyms, in art history they mean something very different. And I want to talk about this before we go on, because after this week, we're going to be looking at very different styles of art in very close proximity time wise. What we're getting into is this idea of moving away from what is culturally appropriate, culturally expected art wise, and moving towards the artists themselves taking kind of control over their subject matter. There are a couple big differences between art periods and art movements. And I don't know if the sound is working, so we're not going to watch this, but I really want you to watch this video. What I will talk about is two very specific differences between art periods and art movements. Art periods are like Egyptian art that we looked at. It may last for thousands of years. Or the Baroque, where it may last for only 200 years. But they are bound by significant expanses of time. That is one difference. And art movement may only last for 50 years, it may only last for 10 years. The difference is that it is very short. So a period is long, a movement is short. The other big difference is that artists in art periods are going to be reflecting the society. They're going to be part of the society. They're going to be an integral part of the society. Perhaps not even aware that they live in this, that there is a society that they live in, because they're just part of the fabric of the society. Art movements, though, are controlled by artists who are responding to society. They're being self-reflective. They're being self-critical of society sometimes. Critical does not mean harsh. They're not derogatory or negative. It just means they are thinking about the society that they're living in. This painting, George Seurat, it's called pointillism. If we look at really close to it, it's made of all these little points and dots. George Seurat is reacting to what he is finding out about the world that he lives in. This is 1884. People are discovering optics, the importance of glasses, the rods and cones in the eye, how you see dots of color already. He's responding to the ideas of photography. Photography was invented 35 years before this, or 50 years before this. And he is responding to what people are doing with photographs. By 1884, you're getting people that have become the first documentarian photographers. This is 20 years after the documentation of the Civil War in photographs. This is 30 years after the first use of photographs in the Crimean War as documentation, photojournalism. And so he's responding to that. Why bother painting if you can make a photograph of the scene? What does what can a painter bring that a photographer can't? He's also responding to the ideas that are becoming popular with culture about the discovery of atoms. Madame Curie is from around this area, and she just is the first person to really articulate what radiation does. So he's responding to more and more of that. He's also responding to his painting fellows that are discovering a different style of painting. And so that's the two big differences. Art periods are bound by culture, and significant lengths of time. Art movements are identified with individuals reacting to culture and are usually much shorter than art periods. So I hope that makes sense about those two different things. Now I want to look at some artists who are members of the Romantic movement. And this, we are starting to talk about movements instead of a period. Right before this, we had the Enlightenment. That was an art period that lasted for about 150 years. Romanticism is an art movement that lasted for about 50 years. And I'd say what the difference is artists like Caspar Friedrich are looking at the cultural landscape around them. They're putting their pulse on society and trying to determine what people are wanting to look at, what might be interesting to people. Remember that there's two shifts that are going on. One is there's a huge growth of middle income possessors, people that are not royals, people that are not political figures that do have money to spend on paintings. That's one aspect. The other aspect is painters are no longer painting for specific families or for groups of people. Now you make a painting and hope it sells. You're trying to make a product that people will be attracted to. So you're exploring what is going to be interesting to people. And this is where the transfer goes from art period into art movement. He's exploring, reflecting, and critiquing the culture around him. In this case, there were also women who were romantic painters as well. So Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog is done in 1817. So this is right after the war where England tried to reclaim the Americas or North America in, I guess, just the United States. They were already had reclaimed Canada. But this is, you have unprecedented communication channels and transportation channels. The world is shifting. Everybody can feel it shifting politically. There's no longer the stability of kingdoms and dynasties. It's going to last, for 150 years. You don't know what's going to happen with these new republics that are showing up, or parliamentary monarchies like in England. So it's just really an interesting time to be alive. And so you have somebody who looks like a prominent figure in society, not at the level of royalty, but somebody who is probably well-to-do, I'd imagine, because of the straight walking stick and the clothes that they're wearing. And they have enough leisure time that they can go on hikes. So they've hiked to the top of this mountain. So obviously they're not a factory worker. And they're looking out over the sea of fog with this landscape that is barely seen. And I think that this is a really good image of what's going on in people's minds and in their hearts culturally at this time period as well. But this is very much romantic. You see the powers of nature in this case. Is nature going to win? Has it already won? He's kind of looking out over this expanse of almost a violent sea of fog, which I think is really amazing. And right here, this link has more images by the same artist. Then here, and then the video also talks about him as well. John Constable, I believe that earlier thing that we looked at was one of his paintings, the view of Salisbury Cathedral. And I hope you can see some of the same type of stuff going on. Notice the subject matter is not the same. This is a man on a mountain. This is a wagon in a stream. However, we can see some of the same kind of elements going on. The sky has a lot of energy. It's not passive. There's a lot of detail given to the trees. Yes, there's a home here. Yes, there's a person here. Yes, there's a wagon. And there's a team there pulling the wagon, and a happy dog. But a lot of energy is given to sharing the detail of the natural world with us, or elements from the natural world. The trees are probably planted by people, so they're not fully natural, but they're growing and they represent the natural world just the same. Right. If we look at this and try to find a focal point, first thing our eye goes to is how expansive the sky is. And then we're brought down to the detail in the trees. The house here almost seems like an afterthought, and the person is recognizable as a human being more out of context, more out of semiotic context than anything else, which I think is really interesting. Again, more paintings by John Constable and a video showing more of his paintings. Now, Francisco Ayez, he didn't do a lot of that natural landscape type of romanticism, but remember that painting The Women of Algiers, he's romanticizing an event. You know, in this case, two people who love each other, for example. It's called The Kiss. And they're meeting in a back alley at the bottom of some stairs. Her dress is pristine, looks absolutely beautiful. It looks like she just put this on a second ago because there's no dirt anywhere around it. This guy looks like the dashing stranger as opposed to any specific figure. She's young, she's lithe, she's grasping at him, he's cradling her face. It looks to me like the romanticism here, instead of extolling nature, is they're kind of this artist is kind of sharing a fantastical version, a fantasy version of a back alley kiss. So same kind of thing. I think that that's really fascinating. It still is dealing with that art period. What is somebody going to want to see hanging in their home? They're not going to want to see the Caravaggio type thing where you see the horse dung and manure and urine and the staining the bottom of her hem, you know, in this back alley. You're not going to want to see that. You're not going to want to see where dogs have urinated on the walls and people have spit against them. You want the walls to be clean. You want this to be romantic. You want it to be presented as a fantasy version of what the reality may very well have been. And this again, there's a video of some of his paintings. National Gallery shows some more of Francisco Ayez's work. Now, there were also writers that were part of this romantic time period. And Mary Shelley is one of my favorite writers from this time. She was dealing with themes of personal responsibility, accountability, parenthood. What does parenthood actually mean? How do you take control of your own life? And she couched it in this kind of world of the Gothic adventure. Her Frankenstein story, or her Frankenstein book, is just one of the many things she wrote. But it's actually called The Modern Prometheus. And it's about a person who fulfills the promise of the Age of Enlightenment and has to come in terms with the encroachment of the natural order of things. What are human beings actually going to do? And she's using those themes, but within all those themes, she's also talking about Victor Frankenstein has a responsibility of being a parent to this child he's created. He denies that. And what are the natural consequences? Well, of course, without having a parental figure to show love and teach ethics and morality, the monster begins as totally inhuman and has to, over time, develop its own morality. When the person who should have been the father figure, should have been caring, should have been protective, ends up being the real monster. And I just think it's a fascinating way that she's been able to explore those themes that these guys do with painting in her writing. Then Eugene Delacroix, remember, he did some other ones for the end of the Age of Enlightenment, but he is also producing stuff now that deals with the romanticization of events. And you can kind of see that in some of his Enlightenment work as well. But this is the romance is not beautifying or he is making this kind of, liberty holding her flag. This is kind of fantastical. There is an element of fantasy here, but he's showing how nasty the smoke is. What's all that smoke is from gunpowder, and he's showing the brutal reality of people who are killed because of the warfare. And this is not, this is just nasty and gross. So this is the natural consequences of the People's Revolution. So he was used as an inspiration for people in the French Revolution, but he was also kind of marked for further study, if you will, because of some of the things he put in that didn't seem to be extolling the virtues of revolution as cleanly as um, the leaders of government would have wanted, to put it mildly. But show some more of his paintings. The wreck of the Medusa is a particularly gruesome one that really shows nature in its fury. And then this also is a video of showing 10 of his paintings. So I want to share with you now, going to realism. This is another art movement that happened about the same time. And I think it captures a lot of what the other movement kind of missed. That movement, Romanticism, kind of captured a lot of what realism missed. Because realism is all about what are the everyday, ordinary things that happen. Romanticism is kind of a fantastical look at the world, where you're romanticizing nature primarily, but you're also making romanticizing events that you kind of wish they happened that way. And again, realism is a movement extolling the virtues of basically the ordinary person. We already talked about the Gleaners. This is three women who are desperately poor, forever immortalized. Here, Britannica talks a little bit more about Millet, and then this shows this is a video of some of his paintings. Now, Gustave Courbet was a realist, but he had a very healthy ego, and he was kind of like the Elton John of the realist painters. I'll say that. And with him, whereas a lot of people were doing, like we saw the women at the waiting for the ferry, we see the three gleaners, ordinary, normal people. Gustave Courbet loved to paint himself. So this is him painting. And he's showing his studio where I don't know if he ever charged admission, but people would bring him gifts when they came, food and stuff like that when they came to watch him paint. And then he'd have people watching him paint. He'd also have people that were asking him to teach them, and people that just like to sit in his presence, hoping that they gain something by being near him. And, so he really thought highly of himself. But this fits into this realism movement because we see these are ordinary folks, regular, ordinary, everyday people. And this is a relatively ordinary event. It's an artist who's just painting. The thing that makes it Gustave Courbet is that he's the center of attention. So, I am kind of joking around a little bit, but you can see that it fits well within that ordinary people doing ordinary things, that it serves as a subject matter for realism. Now, I really like Rosa's work. Rosa Bonheur is one of the women painters that were really successful as part of the realist movement. And on this is basically like the title says, it's a horse fair. So these are ordinary people doing ordinary things. What she focuses on is the horses. Again, the people are almost an afterthought. So the element of this is going to be an ordinary, everyday thing. but she's celebrating it. And yeah, it is kind of a fantastical kind of thing. It has magical light and everything like that. But again, you're focusing on an ordinary horse fair with ordinary people leading their horses around. Yeah, they're a little bit excitable, but that's probably going to be because their handlers are trying to show them off to the people who want to buy them or who they want to buy them. Again, the subject matter is a thing that makes the realist painting a realist painting. It's a horse fair. Now, Harriet Hosmer is a sculptress that I just think is absolutely amazing. I think she is more of a romanticist, but she is considered a realist uh, sculptor. And here's again an article and then a video about her life. But Zenobia in Chains, this is going to be something that is linked to biblical stories. But what Harriet does is she takes and puts people into relatable situations, or I don't know if they're going to be relatable entirely, but more relatable. So this is not going to be a major biblical figure. This is, and it is done in kind of a neoclassical style. You can see that there are a lot of elements to it that tie it very firmly back to Greek and Roman sculpture. But this feels like a real cross between um, Baroque and Renaissance kind of stuff. So we have that kind of static pose that you have in the Renaissance, but you have a lot of detail and movement. Even though Zenobia herself is staying still with the draped chain and her clothing, it has a little bit of those crossing diagonals and swooping angles like you'd see in the Baroque. What kind of brings us into the realist movement is the choice of subject matter. Zenobia is a minor figure and nobody really knows who she is. But women like Harriet, other sculptors at this time, were champions for bringing about an idea that almost anybody could be monumentalized. So this is a woman in chains who looks regal, and she becomes a symbol. She was probably commissioned by a family um, who wanted everybody to know that they had supported or had paid for the beautiful sculpture. But what's fascinating to me about this is you have the classical Greek face, classical Greek hair. You have kind of this Roman costuming, but instead of being painted, it's all sculpted. That you see veins on the back of the hands, which aren't really common in classical Greek sculpture, but really delicate expertise that is astonishing to see. So it doesn't fit in with the overviews that we saw for the paintings and things like that. But Harriet Hosmer is considered to be a realist sculptor. And I think her stuff is just amazing. And I think, again, it kind of moves more towards subject matter. She is just like up here. We see this extolling the virtues, not extolling the virtues, but immortalizing, three poor women. Harriet is immortalizing Zenobia. And by doing that, she becomes a symbol for every woman, perhaps, that feels chained. And I think that that's remarkable. And Edward Manet was a real troublemaker. What he did is he took romantic and Baroque style paintings, even went back into the Renaissance, but he updated them and made them feel almost obnoxiously contemporary. Where this is a woman, a lady of the evening, attended to by her servant, who is just unabashedly staring at us. This is takes place in a brothel. It is nothing really remarkable about the setting. What is remarkable is that Olympia is staring right at us. She's not being the milquetoast woman that one might expect from the Victorian era. I just think it's really interesting. So the realism is these are working class people. And again, celebrating a working class people. And so here's more paintings by Edward Manet, and an article about him right here that talks more about the history. I'm really hoping that you can see, I've switched it to Edward Manet. He is the guy that is considered to be the forerunner to the next movement that we're going to be looking at in Europe. And that next movement is going to be Impressionism, where the paintings that he does, they're disturbing to a lot of people at the time. People are still expecting something to look naturalistic. And he does that, but he starts shifting away from complete naturalism. One of the things that makes some of his stuff uncomfortable for people at the time to look at is because he is taking classical imagery. I'm sorry, I don't see a lot of his paintings showing up. He's taking classical imagery and putting ordinary people in it and having them interact with the viewers in a way that is not unexpected. Like Olympia, typical paintings of a brothel is going to romanticize it, like the Romantics did with that women of Algiers. They're not going to have the woman sitting there displaying herself and looking directly at the viewer. As Spanish, another aspect of realism is when you have a primary figure without an awful lot of background. I see Caravaggio was really good at erasing backgrounds, and I think that English painter we looked at last week, Roberts, I think, who did the orrery, was really good about blacking out the backgrounds. And this is Edward Manet is really good about removing the backgrounds as well and bringing the focus on the ordinary everyday person that he is celebrating. Sometimes you'll see backgrounds, sometimes you won't. The Spanish singer, this guy is probably making his money just by singing tunes in bars or outside of pubs, stuff like that. And you can't really see any detail in his background because the focus is on him and the guitar that he's holding. So stuff like that I think is really interesting. So I know, I'm sorry this is only about an hour or so. I know that's extremely depressing to a lot of you because you love hearing me ramble on. But because we're having problems with the sound, I don't really want to waste a lot of people's time if this does not work out. So I want to do a quick recap. My internet is lagging a little bit, so maybe that is one of the reasons why the sound isn't working. We're dealing with Romanticism and Realism. The time periods we're looking at is the end of the Enlightenment and right before we move into the late 19th century and Impressionism. So the time period we're looking at is in between about 1815 and about 1880, 1890, right in that area. Again, there's no hard and fast dates for this, but I hope you can see that these two movements come about as a direct result of shifting economy, shifting politics, and shifting capacities of the artist. The capacity of the artists no longer have to make their own paints; they can buy them off the shelf. Materials are a lot cheaper, so artists are experimenting. They don't have patrons to pay for their way. They are expected to make a living. This is where you start seeing things like art fairs and galleries crop up, and salons, so that artists have a place to sell their work and that middle income people have a place to go and buy their work. So I just think it's really interesting. And I hope you can see the difference between Romanticism. Human beings almost seem like an afterthought in a lot of these natural scene paintings, and realism, where it almost seems like it's an immortalization of the ordinary person. And then we also talked about really quickly about the difference between art periods and art movements. I am going to see if this is the one that I want. Maybe, okay, all right. This might be actually a good video to watch. Well, it is a good video to watch. We've already covered what she talks about it, but I definitely would recommend watching this video as well. Again, art periods are bound by culture and significant lengths of time. So the culture of the Enlightenment is going to be the culture of Europe, essentially. The culture of Egyptian period is going to be the Egyptian culture. But the significant lengths of time, most of the time, art periods are going to be 50 years to hundreds of years. The Egyptian period lasted for 3,300 years, for over 3,000 years. You know, think about that. I just think it's amazing that Cleopatra, one of the last real queens of Egypt, lived in a time period that was closer to the invention of the cell phone than the building of the Great Pyramids. So think about that for just a second. Then art movements are identified with individuals reacting to culture and are usually much shorter than art periods. So an art movement is going to be artists like Seurat, who was looking at specific aspects of culture and responding to what was going on around him, critiquing perhaps and reflecting on culture, instead of this unnamed artist who is part of their culture. And pointillism lasted for about 25 years. The art movements are going to be much shorter compared to Egyptian period, which was 3,300 years. When the elements of the culture that the artist is critiquing or responding to are no longer present, that's usually when the movement subsides and moves on to something else. The artists don't just give up, they just move on to something else. So those are two big differences. Bound by culture, significant lengths of time, reacting to culture, and usually much shorter period of time. All right. So I hope that really, I hope everybody can hear what I've been talking about, and I hope that really helps. Please go through, watch as many of those videos as you can, and find something that is really interesting to you for your weekly reflection. And you might want to find something that is a romantic painting era painting and something that is a realist era painting, and just contrast those two paintings for your reflection. So, or find something that is labeled as a romantic era painting but doesn't fit into what you know about it, and see if you can pick out the details that make it romantic, or the same thing for a realistic painting. Anyway, I hope you guys have an absolutely wonderful week and weekend. Oh, I remember another thing I wanted to talk about were the projects people did. So I'm going to, sorry about that, I'm jumping around and I didn't see that on my notes. We've had some really fascinating projects. We always do. Every time you turn your project in, also post it to the discussion board. You don't have to respond to anybody's, but I do want you to post it to it. And we've had some really fascinating projects that people have done. I wanted to try to open one of these so we can see. Okay. So this is something, this project is done by Catherine, and it is in the form of a PDF. And this is Jacques-Louis David. He was one of the painters that we talked about. And this is his Enlightenment stuff that was used to really kind of push people, or to motivate people to take part in the French Revolution. And then he went on to do more romantic work as well. And he was one of the definers of the Romantic era. And what Catherine did is create a PDF about David's life and what he did. And this PDF has 8 images embedded. They're all under 2 inches. And then at the very end, Catherine did a the list of citations. And notice that each one has the accessed on list. I did want to point out something. As you do this, make sure you're alphabetizing this. So, for example, in this, and I want you to go over, and Catherine already made the corrections that were needed, but when I gave you several I gave you 10 different sites to get your citations from. Look over the citation and double check, make sure that everything is spot on. Because sometimes the AI will put things into the citation that don't necessarily need to be there. Like, for example, this is a website blurb from Encyclopedia Britannica's editors all the way to for an advanced degree. None of that belongs in the citation, but the AI didn't know that. And the editors of Encyclopedia Britannica, you could also write that, you could change that, you could leave that the way it is, or you could write it as Encyclopedia Britannica editors or editors of Encyclopedia Britannica, and you leave out the altogether. So, just some things to be aware of. Sometimes you'll see that. Sometimes I've seen some citations. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not sharing that. Okay, now I'm showing this. Now you guys can see the works cited right through here. This is what I was talking about. This area right here does not need to be in there. But of course, I'm asking you to reference those AI sites. And so if something like that happens, I'll just point it out. Please just edit and make the change. And this is what I was saying. The editors of Encyclopedia Britannica, that is perfectly fine. You could also change that, take the off, so it just says editors of Encyclopedia Britannica. That would be fine too. But no, I want you to really notice Catherine has included the accessed on phrase in each and every one of the citations, and that's wonderful. And through the body of this work, each of the images are about 2 inches, and this is great. And you can, what Catherine shows is the shift from Jacques-Louis David, his work from Enlightenment era work to all the way to Romantic era work. And Catherine did a great job of doing that. So as you do your own project, look and make sure you're following one of the 6 outlines. And there's 3 for discovery projects, and there's 3 for research projects. I'm doing a 7th one, so there'll be a 7th option. I think I'm going to put it under discovery, and it will be an AI evolution, where you will use AI. You'll plug into AI 5 images that fit an artist, an art movement, or an art period. And you're going to put in some descriptors that you feel are appropriate for to help define that artist, art period, or art movement. And then you're going to ask AI to generate an image using that prompt. You're going to look at it, evaluate it, and then have the AI make a change. Make 3 changes in the prompt, have the AI do it again, see if that's better, and then you can present the whole thing with your final critique of the final image. Explain your process, and you can either present it as a video or as a PDF. And I'm going to, I will finish the outline for that and post it later this week, so you can see that too. And next week we'll talk about it. So if anybody wants to do that as one of the potential projects, you do not have to. There is no obligation, but that is going to be one of the potential projects that people can do. And I will tell everybody as soon as I make that change and make that edit. All right. Well, thank you again for joining me tonight. I'm listening to this video rather, and thank you very much for being with me. And I hope that the sound works. If it doesn't, I'll have to record this again, which will be extremely boring for everybody involved. But thanks again, and I hope you guys have a great week and weekend, and I will see you next Tuesday.